Hey, what's up guys? It's Matt Wakeman here, MJW006, and today I'm back with part 3 of our Heads Up Sit and Go series, which is technically video 4. I apologise for the delay on the video. I've been a little bit sick, as you can probably tell. Excuse my snuffles throughout the video. And today we're going to be talking about late game strategies and playing in the late game, and particularly finding optimal play. What I intended to do when I first sat down and started working out how I was going to attack this video was really go through the mathematics and get into the crux of a couple of strategies, that being Nash, Equilibrium, and Sage, and really get into the mathematics and try to get you guys to understand where they've been derived from and best understand that so you can more effectively use them in your games. But once I gave it some thought, I really decided that it wasn't necessarily the way to go, because it's not going to be that helpful to you guys to understand the maths behind, Nash, Equilibrium, or Sage. It's not that difficult to go and have a look for it, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to really necessarily be recommending that you use either of these strategies today. More that we try to find a more opponent-specific optimal play given certain circumstances. Okay, so we're going to get into it. Hopefully, that will all make a lot more sense to you throughout the course of the video. So, when we're talking about the late game, we're talking about the blind levels 30, 60, and onwards, which typically makes the maximum effective stacks 25 big blinds maximum, I do believe. However, you'll find that only 30, 60, and 40, 80 are levels on Full Tilt Poker. Poker Stars go straight from 25, 50 to 50 and 100. So there are going to be elements of late game in that 25, 50 level on both sides, particularly in the turbo games. So we are going to go into 25, 50 play a little bit, even though we touched on it in the last video. It's all about the push fold. A lot of late game play and late game strategies are going to depend on your pre-flop play. So it's going to be pushing, folding, calling. Okay, so it's going to be pretty straightforward, and a lot of it's going to be pre-flop that we discuss. The next point is we need to determine our opponent's ranges and adjust our ranges accordingly. Okay, so that's basically what these two main approaches are down here, is Nash, Equilibrium, and Sage. It's basically a set of ranges, a set of hands, but they match up so that the pushing range will match up to the calling range to make it unexploitable. But what we want to do is all of our opponents are going to be different. So we need to best determine our opponent's range for pushing, calling, folding, and then we need to adjust our ranges to suit that. Okay, so because Nash, Equilibrium, and Sage are just systems, we're going to find that not very often are our opponents actually going to be sticking to them. So what we need to do is we need to find a more appropriate approach given a certain circumstance. So Nash Equilibrium is the first thing we're going to talk about. It's a mathematical derivative of minimum strength hands you can push, call with based upon a stack to blind ratio. So what this means is basically there was a mathematical formula put into place, and what they did was they determined a set of hands that you can push with and a set of hands that you can call with based upon how many big blinds you have at any given point in time. Okay. Now, when we actually have a look at the chart in a second, it's going to seem super loose to a lot of people, and that's because almost everyone is too tight with their pushing ranges, with their calling ranges. Being that not many people actually start up their poker development as a heads-up player. They generally start, in cash games, or they start in MTTs. Obviously ranges in them games are going to be different, but that's how we learn, and that's where we start out. So, and we kind of carry that across to heads-up poker, and I don't think people realize how profitable it is to be pushing really loose, or how profitable it is to be calling really loose. Okay. Obviously, the pushing part is, we can be looser with our pushing than we can with our calling. But quite often, It's also going to be correct to be calling pretty light as well. As I mentioned earlier, Nash is very rarely going to be the correct strategy, yet it's a great strategy to understand, and this goes with both cases tonight, with Nash and with Sage. You know, all I want you to do is to know what they are, to understand how they work, and just recognize them. Because what I'm actually going to suggest is something, you know, a little bit different from these, but they're great strategies to have by your side because they are unexploitable, so you can always revert to them if you really want to. Okay, so we're going to have a look at that Nash chart now. Okay, so you guys may be already familiar with these charts. I did mention them and did show you guys briefly in the last video. But I just wanted to go over really quickly how they actually work a little bit better. As I said, I'm not going to go into the mathematics of how they were derived or anything like that. I just wanted to quickly go over with you how they work, where you can find it. Okay, so as you can see here, I have a website here in which it's located. I really advise that maybe you copy and paste this or print it out and keep it on your desktop if you are going to play heads up sit and goes, and you are actually going to use this strategy because it's a really, really quick and easy way to determine pushing and calling ranges. I'd love to say that you can use it as a guide because to a degree I do use it as a guide at times when I'm really unsure against certain opponents, particularly thinking opponents who I do believe are pushing and calling relatively close to optimally. I may pull this up from time to time and actually use the chart. So what we have here is our set of starting hands. Now this is the push chart, and as you can see, we have our cards from ace to deuce along the top and ace to deuce to down the left. All of our pocket pairs obviously run straight down the middle here. In here we have our offsuit cards, and up here we have our suited cards. Now it's very, very simple. All we need to do is to match up, let's just say we have 8-4 offsuit. All we need to do is go to our 8 and our 4 and match it up, and we get 2.3. Now this 2.3 means that as the pusher, if the effective stacks are 2.3 big blinds, it's a or less, it's a profitable push. Okay. For example, let's just say Jack 10 suited, and we go to here, 20 big blinds or less, or greater than 20 big blinds for that matter, it's going to be a profitable push. Okay. In the pushing hands, as you can see, this is going to look really loose to, you know, a lot of you guys, but in reality, it's typically going to be rather correct in what it's saying. For example, you know, 6-7 suited here, it's saying that you can push this with 20 big blinds, or more than 20 big blinds for that matter. And the same goes for 7-5 suited. I tend to disagree with these, you know, it being 20 big blinds or more, but it has been mathematically formulated, and technically, as I said before, it's not, it's unexploitable, okay? But in saying that, it's not going to be optimal because against some opponents, the calling ranges are going to be way too wide to make, you know, 7-8 suited a profitable push, okay? Now, the calling chart down here works in exactly the same manner, but as you can see, these numbers are going to be a lot tighter. As we just saw then, 6-7 suited according to the push chart, you can push with 20 big blinds or more even, okay? 6-7 suited as a calling hand, 5.4 big blinds effective stacks. Okay, so there's a pretty big discrepancy there between your pushing ranges and your calling ranges. Okay, so what it's suggesting is that you need to be calling much tighter than obviously what you're pushing, which makes sense But that's basically how the charts work. They're very, very straightforward. This is where you can locate them, these charts, and just print them out and pop them on your desktop if you do choose to use this method. Okay, so we've done Nash now. Sage is a little more complex and a little more mathematical, yet it's still, pretty basic and very similar in a lot of senses to Nash equilibrium. Nash is probably easier in-game, purely because there's just a simple chart and you don't have to calculate anything. But Sage is still a really useful strategy that you can actually learn, and it can be relatively quick if you do get to know it. Personally, I don't use it because I'm lazy, but if you do actually take the time, a lot of people believe that Sage is actually a little closer to being unexplodable than what Nash is. Okay, so Sage is based around a couple of concepts. The first is a power index. In order to formulate our power index, we have to use our power numbers. So our cards are our deuce right through to the 10 represent exactly that. By that I mean that 2 equals 2, 8 equals 8, 9 equals 9, and so on and so forth. Okay? Right up to 10, which obviously equals 10, Jack is 11, Queen's 12, King's 13, and Ace is 15. Okay? So you need to remember that the only thing that's out of the ordinary here is that Ace is worth 15. When we're calculating our power index, the first thing we need to do is to double the number of our highest card and add the number of our lowest card. If it's a pocket pair, we're going to add 22, and if it's suited, we add another 2. The sum of all of these numbers is our power index. Okay? So as an example here, if we start the hand with Ace 4 suited, our Ace is 15, obviously our 4 equals 4. To calculate our power index, we're going to multiply our highest card, being the Ace, by 2, add the 4, and add the 2 for the suited. Okay, so we're going to have 30 plus 4 plus 2, which gives us a power index of 36. Okay, so this is relatively straightforward, as you can see, and it's not difficult at all to calculate our power index. Then we have a pretty simple chart here, which you can find online also. The best place to probably look for this is on 2+2, just search for Sage. You can go to the Heads Up NL forum, and it's actually in the facts sticky. What we have here, our R is the ratio of the short stack to big blind. Okay, so this is how many big blinds effective we're playing. So 1 through to 7 here. So if the big blind effective is 5, for example, in order to jam from the small blind, in order to be the pusher, we need a power index of 24 or more. In order to be calling with 5 big blinds effective, we need a power index of 28 or more. Okay? And this goes right throughout each of them. Obviously, as you can see here, with 1 big blind, we call with any. I think that's a given. And these charts actually go a little bit higher than this, but what I've done is I've just made this chart and whacked it onto the screen here so you guys can get a good idea of what the Sage chart actually looks like. Okay? Once again, this has been formulated mathematically. By people who are smarter than me, and I'm not going to go into how it was derived or anything like that. But basically, that's just how it works. Once again, it's considered an unexplodable system. So it's not a bad thing to learn and just to understand how it actually works. Okay, so should we actually use these strategies? As I mentioned a few times throughout this video, both strategies are unexplodable, but it does not mean optimal, and therefore we're not going to win the most money by using these strategies against someone who's not using the strategies themselves. Okay? The reason being is that they're basically both equilibrium strategies, meaning that there's an equal and opposite reaction to a pushing or a calling, okay? And the ranges that are given by the Nash chart or by the Sage chart are actually going to be the reverse of each other, okay? So they're going to cancel each other out, and it's going to be, you know, to a degree neutral EV if you're both using Nash or you're both using Sage. But in reality, neither. It's very rare, and I don't think I've ever come across a situation through the thousands of heads-up sit-and-goes that I've played where I've established that an opponent actually is pushing to Nash or they are pushing to Sage. Okay? So our pushing, folding, and our calling should really depend on our opponents and what we've observed of their tendencies. So why did I even bother to show you guys these two strategies if it's not optimal? Okay? They're both good to know, particularly when we're in doubt. We can always revert to a strategy which we know is unexploitable. Okay? So if we are playing against an opponent and we really can't get a good grasp for what they're pushing, their folding, their calling ranges are, then we can revert to one of these strategies and use it to give us the confidence to make the pushes and make the calls and make the folds and know that our strategy isn't exploitable. I think that's the crux of it, is basically, you know, they're good strategies to understand, and I think they give you, you know, a better understanding of pushing and folding ranges in general, yet they're not going to actually be optimal. So, as I mentioned earlier, most players are way too tight, okay? The pushing ranges and the calling ranges that a lot of people actually play with are going to be way too tight. So often it's going to be it's going to be optimal for you to be pushing looser and calling tighter, okay? Because they're going to be pushing tighter and calling way too tight, okay? Finding the most optimal play is really going to depend on your ability to assess your opponent's ranges. Okay, so we're going to do a sweat session in a second, and I'm going to go through the thought process in determining our opponent's range and in assessing our opponent's ranges so that we can best find our ranges, our pushing ranges, our calling ranges. So we're going to go through that in the sweat session. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the forums, obviously. And we can discuss this hand reading to a degree and assessing our opponent's ranges so that we can find that most optimal strategy. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually show you a post made on 2+2 by a popular 2+2er in the Heads Up NL forum, going by the name of Insane Steve, and it really highlights how hand values change based on your opponent's tendencies. Okay, so by this, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how pocket pairs, suited connectors, ace-x hands, king-x hands, Broadway cards, how the values of these hands actually change based on what we observe of our opponents. And it's really going to tie into this point right here and finding the most optimal play based on our opponent's tendencies. Okay, so I'm going to pop that up right now before we do get to the sweat session. I'll be back in a sec. Okay, back now, guys. What we actually have and what Steve's done is he's actually gone through with certain sets of hands in certain situations and has shown mathematically how profitable it is to be pushing certain hands. Okay. This is more applicable to a little bit deeper than the play that we're talking about before, but it's certainly highly applicable to shorter stack play, and it gives us a little bit of an insight into how hand values actually change against certain opponents. The maths of all of this, I'm not going to go into too great a detail, but this is really specific to adjusting to your opponent and how you should adjust your ranges to your opponent's ranges. Okay, so in the first situation, we're playing a hypothetical aggressive opponent who's raising his button 2/3 of the time with blinds at 25-50 and effective stacks of 25 big blinds. Okay, Now, what we have here is a set of 5 hands. Twos, ace 2 offsuit, jack 10 suited, 7-5 suited, and 3-2 offsuit. So which of these hands are going to be good to shove over his range? It really depends on what he's calling with, okay? So now we're going to go into all of the different types of situations based on his calling ranges, and see how that affects our equity in given circumstances. So here in the first one, Villain's going to be a solid player. This is our first 3-bet shove, and he's going to respect our first raise, okay? So his calling range here is going to be, we're going to assume that it's 6s plus, ace 10 off plus, ace 9 suited plus, and king queen, okay? That actual range is the top 10, well, 10.4% of hands, which means he's folding 84.4% of the time and calling the rest of the time, okay? So 84.4% of the time, we're going to gain 150 chips, okay? So we're going to add 126.61 to our chip equity, or our chip EV, for this move. Then if he calls, the equity for each of our hands against this tight range that we've defined up here, that being that 10.4% of hands, our equity of each of these hands here, for deuces it's going to be 37 or 38%, 30% for ace 2, 37% here for jack 10 suited, 32% for 7-5, and 25% for 2-3 offsuit. Okay? So the 15.6% of the time that we are actually called, we're going to show a loss, which is going to be the 15.6% of the time that we lose 1,250 chips. Okay? Multiplied by the percentage of the loss minus the percentage of the win. Okay? This is all the maths basically. What's important here is that if our opponent is opening wide, that is, that he's raising his button 2/3 of the time, yet he's calling really tight, 3-bet shoving any 2 cards is going to be plus chip equity. Okay? That's what this has shown us, because he's folding that 84.4% of the time, and we're actually gaining them 150 chips 84.4% of the time, and losing this amount of the time, right here, we're actually going to, it's going to be profitable to be shoving any 2 cards. Okay? Also against a tight calling range, the suited connected hands play better than a weak ace. And that's because his calling range is going to contain more aces which dominate your hand than suited connectors. So the pair of course, is the best hand to be shoving against a tight calling range. And it's also why raising to 3 times the big blind at 25 big blind effective, or at the 25-50 level, is generally elite. And I did suggest in our last video that raising to 100 or raising to 125 is the more profitable play. And the reason for that is that it makes shoving less profitable for our opponent from the big blind. Okay, so shoving 25 big blinds over a raise of 100 is going to be less profitable, and it's really highly going to affect their long-term chip equity, as opposed to if we're opening to 150, because the times, this 84.4% of the time, they're actually going to only be collecting 100 chips from the pot rather than 150 chips from the pot. Obviously, poker's all about making adjustments, and if we just keep shoving, then our opponent's going to adjust, okay? And we need to adjust with him. And a non-thinking villain, on the other hand, is likely to react in a very similar way, because he's more likely to just get, annoyed that you're shoving so much and start calling lighter anyway, which would be the correct adjustment that our opponent would make had he been a thinking villain. Okay, so in the next example, I'm not going to go through it all again, but now our opponent's calling a little bit wider. Okay, so our opponent's calling top 15.8% of hands, pocket 4s plus, ace 8 off plus, ace 5 suited plus, king jack off plus, and king 10 suited plus. Okay? Once again, Steve highlights the equity of each of our hands against that range, which is obviously going to be slightly better than against a tight calling range. But the finding here, when our opponent's calling a little bit wider, is that the ace-2 off actually fares worse than the low-suited connector, and Jack-10 suited is very close to the pairs. This is because ace-2 is crushed by more of our opponent's range, okay? Because when we widen his range here, we widened, as you can see, here where we had ace-10 off and ace-9 suited plus, we now have ace-8 off and ace-5 suited plus, okay? So it's going to be dominated by a large proportion of his actual calling range. The Jack-10 suited here is still doing well against ace-X suited, okay? Or ace-X off. It's also doing okay against lower pairs as well, okay? So in the third scenario, our opponent is a little bit wider again. He's shoving with, he's calling with any pair, any ace, king-10, king-9, queen-jack plus, queen-10 suited plus, jack-10 suited plus, okay? So once again, this is the top 26.1% of hands, and again Steve goes into the equity that our hands have against his range, okay? So now, only the pocket pairs are profitable against his range, okay? So he adds in another hand here, which shows us that we need to widen our shoving range slightly, okay? So against a wider calling range, our middle ace hands, our king X hands, are all going to play a lot better against a wider calling range, okay? I don't think I explained this all that well to start with, but what it is here, in determining whether a play's plus chip EV, is that here we win 150 chips. We have a positive 126.61 chip EV for this move, okay? When we're shoving over a raise, and he is only calling with the top 10.4% of hands, okay? So we have 126.61 positive chip expectation. All of these hands here, if we subtract this number from our starting number, okay, it's still going to be a positive number. So we're still going to carry a positive chip expectation, okay? In this case, we have 114.47. If we subtract these numbers from this number, we're still going to have a positive expectation, and we can see that the Jack-10 suited is actually going to have a higher chip expectation than what Ace-2 is, okay? And that Deuce-3 off is going to be the only hand out of this set of hands which is actually a loser, okay? In this scenario, when he's calling wider, our chip EV for folds is 91.3. The only hand that's profitable here is the pocket pair. Also, Ace-8 is actually more profitable. If we subtract 28.2 away from 91.3, we're going to end up with a higher chip EV than even pocket deuce. Okay? So, in the last situation, he's going to be calling with any pair, any ace, king 7 plus, suited king, queen 8 plus, queen 6 suited plus, jack 9 off, jack 7 suited. Okay, so a super wide range, including these suited connectors here. Okay, which is the top 39.7% of hands. Which means that we only have 60.72 in chip equity when we get folds. Okay? Yet our hands here, our hands equity or our chip equity, our chip expected value, sorry, against his range of hands here is going to actually result in 2s being profitable, ace-2 being not profitable, slightly not profitable. Jack 10 suited being very close, yet the Ace 8 and the pocket pair are going to go way up in value, and they're actually going to add on to the chip equity. Chip expected value. And we're actually going to have bigger numbers than what we started with, as opposed to all these situations where we had lower numbers. Okay, so now we can be 3-bet shoving Ace 8 and pocket pairs for pure value. Okay, we're not even doing it for fold equity anymore. All of these hands have an expected value from his calling range. Okay, so once again, like in my other videos, I hope I haven't mumbled on too much in this scenario. I did just want to show you guys, because I wanted to show you guys how these different hands actually change in value based on our opponent's tendencies. Because as we went through that, we seen swings in the actual value of a pocket pair and swings in the value of middle suited connectors in Jack 10, in Ace Rag, and we've seen how them values changed against certain calling ranges. Okay, so in summary, that Steve actually made here, against an opponent that we suspect is not calling our 3-bet very often, the edge actually comes in shoving a lot from fold equity. In the chance that we are called, it's best for us to have a pair, a middle suited connecting hand, rather than a bad ace, because our bad aces are often going to be dominated. Okay, against an opponent that's going to be calling our 3-bet shove somewhat wide, but not a lot, our edge is still in fold equity, but the suited connected hands drop in value, and the marginal aces increase in value. Because he's actually going to be calling with more hands that the ace, ace X is actually ahead of. That means more king X hands, more queen X hands. Okay? Against an opponent that we think will call a lot of his raising range, so he's not actually going to be raise folding a lot. Our EV in shoving actually comes from the fact that a middling ace X hand or a low pair is actually a favorite against whatever he's calling with. Okay, so against his range, our ace X and our pocket pairs are actually ahead. In this scenario, our suited connectors shouldn't even be shoved, because there's actually little to no value in shoving suited connectors when that's what we're doing. Okay, we don't have any fold equity anymore, but what we do have is pure equity against his calling range. 3-bet shoving any pocket pair over a 3x raise with 25 big blinds effective, or less for that matter, is almost never going to be a mistake. Okay, you're going to have equity against his calling range with a pocket pair in any scenario in a 25 big blind or less scenario. Okay, so I hope I haven't gone in too deep here with you guys, because I didn't really want to go into a huge long mathematical explanation necessarily. I did just want to give you guys a look at this so that you could understand that against certain calling ranges, and if you can estimate these calling ranges in-game, then this can certainly be very helpful. Right now I'm just going to get to the sweat session, so I will be back in a second. Hey guys, back now. I've got a pre-recorded couple of tables here. They're both $55 heads-up sit-and-goes. They're both turbos as well, so that we can get to that late game a little bit quicker, because I know that the last few videos have gone a bit long. So we'll get straight to it now. I don't really want to talk too much about the early stages of the heads-up sit-and-goes as we go through them. I'm going to talk about a couple of the interesting spots and how the dynamics changing throughout the course of the match, and how my read is actually on my opponent throughout the course of the early game. But other than that, I don't really want to stop and really start discussing hands in a great deal of detail, because we've already kind of gone through that in the first few. So here's a pretty clear C-bet. As we've discussed, the ace-high board. We're going to bet... Sorry, I'll play the video. So it's a pretty clear C-bet there on that table. And it's a pretty good card to double barrel, really, because there's so many draws that he calls the flop with that he folds the turn. So we do go ahead and double barrel. and he calls again. That's pretty much us done with the hand. Had the river been a brick, I mean, I'm checking it behind, obviously. He open shoves, which is the first time that he's pretty bad, because we expect that, you know, a lot of the draws, some players, aggressive players, are going to play their draws aggressively on that flop, because the equity of a good combo draw, even against if I had ace-x, is going to be relatively good. On the left, I think it's his first open. We go ahead and free bet ace-jack, which is pretty standard. And what it does is it sets up an aggressive dynamic straight away, which you're going to see us definitely take the more aggressive approach on both tables, and really try to control the match. You're going to see a little bit more in turbos, because I see it as more important to start gathering chips ASAP in turbos rather than waiting for certain situations. Well, not waiting, but having a little bit more time to wait for situations in regular speed heads-up sit-and-goes. I really want to just push and apply a lot of pressure to our opponents in turbo heads-up sit-and-goes, and gather as much chips as we can, so when it does get to push-fold, we get the extra chances, so that if we're the big stack come push-fold time, we can have them all in more times than they have us all in. Therefore, obviously, a flip being a flip, which you generally get involved in late in heads-up sit-and-goes, if you do get to the late game, what's going to happen is, if you actually, you know, have your opponent in more times than they have you all in, obviously you're going to win flips 50% of the time. Therefore, you're actually going to win more matches long run by actually having your opponents all in more often than they have you all in. On the left here, I think it's a pretty... it's not that thin, actually. But what we note here is that he check-called 2 straights there with top pair. Okay, he didn't bet the flop, he didn't bet the turn, he didn't bet the river with top pair, albeit not a great kicker. But we're certainly going to note that, and we've already started to kind of think that the guy on the left, J.Dumas, is going to be relatively tight in his ranges. And this is certainly something that's applicable even when you get into the late game. Your observations throughout the early game, so if someone's typically passive in the early game, and they tend to play their hands passively, then that's generally going to carry over into the late game as well. If you find that they're really tight early on, generally it carries into the late game as well. A lot of these characteristics are going to carry into, you know, your push-fold situations. You need to be aware, though, if dynamics do change, or if they do start actually changing their play. And you need to take particular note of that and adjust accordingly. In both these matches, however, I'm pretty sure that the reads that I develop early on against these guys is pretty much carried throughout the match. The reads, basically, that I've already got, as I mentioned, is that the guy on the left here, Jay, seems really tight. He's passive for that matter, because he has been tending to... once we 3-bet him, he started limping his button, okay, so it really just shut him down pretty quick smart. On the right, the guy seems really bad. You know, that's probably, you know, not very nice to say. It's not a very good way of putting it. But basically, he seems to have some pretty glaring leaks, to the point where he's going to make a lot of spewy plays. So in situations like that, we're going to be more inclined to let him hang himself in the late game. We're going to be more inclined to be, say, min-raising our button with our strong hands, or limping our button with our strong hands, and expect him to spaz out a certain percentage of the time. On the right-hand table, I lead out with our 10 here with a middle pair, and it can be argued that it has showdown value, but a lot of the time we're just going to take the pot down right there, as well as forming somewhat of a dynamic as well. So he goes ahead and raises us. There's not going to be very many, you know, turns or rivers which are that great for our hand, so I elect to just fold it. On the left, we flop middle pair with a gut shot. I don't check the flop, but I do go ahead and delayed c-bet this turn because it's a low card. It really doesn't connect with that board, so we're just going to go ahead and bet again. Okay, so as you can see, the effective stacks already are starting to get short. On the right-hand video, we're already at 25.50 with the blind levels being so short in the turbos on full tilt. So we're already starting to get into some late game, because if we think about it, and we start thinking about Insane Steve's post that we just went over, the effective stacks now are going to be 25 big blinds or less. So shoving is going to be somewhat the correct strategy in some spots, rather than 3-betting to, say, 350 or something like that. Okay. Now on the right, I open King 9, which is pretty standard. And he 3-bets is pretty small. I don't mind peeling here. You know, at this point in time, we're going to be getting it in with top pair against this guy particularly. King 9 suited, it flops really well. There's a lot of flops which can hit our hand. C-betting this board would be pretty bad. A lot of cases like this, he's actually going for a check raise on that board. When a player who's shown spewy tendencies goes ahead and 3-bets you for the first time, and then checks this board, typically without a decent piece of it, we're better off checking it back. I mean, I'm probably actually checking back Queen Jack even on that board, purely because I just think I'm getting check shoved all the time, and I really don't think that I'm that good against his check shoving range, even if I do have top pair there. Okay, so we're going to be folding that river. We got a turn which was kind of a trappy turn because it gave us a ton of outs. But we're going to be folding this river, obviously. Even for his retarded little bet there on the end. Sometimes, you know, against certain opponents, King High is going to be good to call down with. It's just not one of them situations, obviously. Okay, so as you can see, I'm already short here on the right-hand table. I'm playing with 16 big blinds. What I want to do is I want to see pretty quickly how he's going to react to my open shoving, or my shoving over his limps, or my shoving over his raises. Sorry. So I go ahead with Queen 10, which is going to play reasonably well. And if we did have a look at a Nash chart, for example, it would show us that Queen 10 was an unexploitable shove there. But I'm going to start getting a feel and start changing the dynamic to suit me, so that I can start coming back in this match and start building my chip stack back up. Okay, so on the left, we're still, you know, playing over 20 big blinds effective. So we're going to really concentrate on this right-hand table for now. I'll keep an eye on the left though. Once again, 9s, we're just going to open shove it over his limp, and we're going to, obviously that one was for value, but what it's doing is it's setting a dynamic. I folded my buttons a couple of times here, and now what I started thinking was, I started thinking about whether he actually understood push fold, and whether I could just min raise him, and it would do the same trick here, seeing as though I'd started shoving. He actually flats, but what I was really trying to do was see if, because we'd been starting to get really aggressive and starting to stick our stack in, some people go into their shell and are just waiting for hands which they can, you know, go to the felt with. I was going to see if he was going to react that way, but as it was, he flatted out of the big blind, so it kind of changed my thinking a little bit, that I just had to start, you know, keep pushing on this guy. Another thing that they also do is they'll start doing this. When you start shoving on someone's limp, often someone who hasn't been raising that much will all of a sudden start min-raising. And generally it's a defensive thing where they want to block you from making that shove. Whereas in reality, you know, a lot of the time you should treat it almost exactly the same. Here he actually had a hand, so it kind of disproves my theory to a degree. And we obviously run good. But that's typically what some villains tend to do. Okay, Ace 8 here, is an open, and I'm snap calling a shove, particularly because of the last hand. He actually has a hand again. So, as you can see, this guy was actually... his ranges were actually pretty tight for shoving and for calling shoves, okay? When he called my shove, it was with ace-jack, where he'd been folding beforehand. I probably made an incorrect read to a degree about his min-raising, but nonetheless I had, a hand which is a shove in any given situation. But in that spot where I had tens, I'm probably shoving on him with, well, my range for shoving on him there is actually going to be really, really wide. And when he actually shoves this time, he actually has a pair as well. So, his actual ranges here seemed, in the short time that it actually took us to bust him, actually seemed a lot tighter than what you would actually expect from a player who I had a read on to be relatively spewy. Okay? Once again, on the right, we run pretty good. So, okay, so on the left here, we have him down to around about 20 big blinds effective. And the blinds have just gone up to 30-60, okay? So this is more specifically what we were talking about when we're talking about late game, okay? The dynamic on the left-hand table is he's been, as I mentioned earlier, pretty tight passive, okay? So 4-7 was a fold, obviously, and when he min-raises, my range is actually going to be a little bit tighter because his min-raising range is quite different to the min-raising range that we would expect from a normal villain. Because he's only been raising 12% of the time, I actually expect him to have a hand. When he does go ahead and raise. Another dynamic that had been in place is he'd been folding to an absolute ton of C-bets. This board here is typically not a great board to be C-betting, but as we did mention in the last video, when effective stacks get short, we're going to be taking a lot of small stabs at pots, but we're not going to be, running multi-barrel bluffs or anything like that. On top of that, as much as that board wasn't great for us, our equity in the pot, even against a pair there, isn't that bad because we actually have 2 overs and a gut shot. So, that was a situation where I'm happy to take a stab. He hadn't check-raised us at all, so it's a pretty safe spot to actually go ahead and take stab. And this is a really good opponent to be making them stabs against. Okay? Once again, I take a small stab here at the pot. Doesn't come off for me, so I just check the river. I've taken my stab at the pot. Didn't come off. I expect him to have a piece. Pretty simple. 2-6 offsuit. We're not going to do anything crazy out of line just yet, even though I could probably, at this point in time, I believe I could profitably just shove over any limps. Open shove over any limps, even though we're almost 20 big blinds deep. That would be a strategy which would likely be unexploitable. Unexploitable, not a great word, but it would be plus EV for us, yet it wouldn't necessarily be what we would call optimal play. Okay. So I don't even bother taking a stab here. Okay, so now we have our Nash chart here on the right-hand table, just so I can discuss if there are any spots where we can use it as a guide. Okay, now once again, 9-4 suited, it's not a standard open, but he'd been folding so much that I'd folded a couple of my buttons, and I started to realize that the amount that he was actually folding to C-bets, basically any 2 cards here were going to be profitable against this guy. And we can really grind him down because I don't think that he realized that with effective stacks being so short, by flatting and check folding, he's giving away 2 big blinds, every hand that he's in the big blind. Okay? I don't think that he realized that that was actually the situation and that his stack was going to dwindle. It took me a little bit longer than it should have to recognize this guy's tendency of, flatting and check folding. But I'm certainly going to abuse it now. Okay? A6, I was definitely shoving there, okay, with 15 big blind. I was definitely shoving. and I went to type in the chat box and show you guys my thoughts at the time of the match, and I accidentally hit enter. So whatever. I tried the min raise this time, and it was just a value there to try to just get a little bit more chips in the pot because we have the best hand so often. Okay. Okay, so the Queen 9 was also a shove had he limped. Jack 7 suited is definitely a shove here, okay? He now only has 11 big blinds, or 12 big blinds. If we have a look over here, you know, we can be shoving this profitably according to Nash. But our shoving ranges are going to be so much wider against this guy because he has shown us that he's so tight and he's going to be so passive and not actually be looking us up. You know, 3-4 offsuit here was going to be a profitable shove when he limped. Okay, I don't want to push him to the point that, you know, he's going to go over that threshold where he just starts calling us with any two cards because he realizes what we're doing. You know, I want him to still believe us to a certain degree. Here, I should have led the flop. The board's pretty, you know, not a lot of hands are going to hit that board. And he'd been folding just so often. Okay, so now that we set up the image to shove, I'm just going to go ahead and shove. Even though I know his calling ranges are pretty tight, there's no need to mess around and min raise here and c-bet with big blinds, with him only having 11 big blinds. Okay, if we min raise here and make him put in 2 BBs pre-flop, and then we c-bet 2 BBs at the flop, effectively we've put in half his stack, so we're actually going to have the odds to be calling it off basically in any situation. Right then, with sixes, he tanked before he actually called, which is pretty funny, because sixes are actually just a super snap call in that situation on his behalf. Okay, so it was kind of weird that he actually requested time and thought about the sixes before he actually went ahead and called there. But what it also did was, because we actually did have a hand at that time, it actually showed him that, you know, he may actually get tighter from that, because he may actually think that we're only shoving good hands and that we're card racking him. Okay, so as I said, my image has changed because he's only seen us show down strong hands. King 7 suited is absolutely a shove. Okay, King 7, I prefer shoving hands like King 7 suited, King 8 suited, and, you know, smaller suited kings. Like, I'd prefer to shove King 3 suited a lot of the time than I would Ace 3 suited, because, especially against a tight guy, because I'm less likely to be actually dominated by his range of hands. I'm more likely to have 2 live cards with King 3 suited than I am with Ace 3 suited versus range. Okay? This time, I actually do go ahead and lead. As much as he hasn't raised all that much, I kind of expect him to be min-raising or shoving his aces, his strong aces or kings here, so I don't really see many in his range. Once again, the blinds have gone up, so we're playing 12 big blinds or 13 big blinds effective here, okay? So it's just going to effectively be a shove fest. He limps, ace-jack's an easy shove. This time he snap calls with 3s, which is kind of funny considering that he actually tank called with 6s before. And we win a flip because we run good. And now it's just trivial. Okay, so, you know, he has 4 big blinds. As we can see here, we actually go and have a look at 8-4 offsuit just to, you know, show you in the video. It's not a shove. It's never a shove because he's basically calling any 2 cards. You know, some tight players actually aren't calling any 2 cards, but right there, I kind of think that he's calling fairly wide. So, in that case, you know, 8-4 offsuit, I tend to not shove it. Because we don't really bet anything. Okay, so King 4, as I said before, now this guy showed us that right now, even when he had 4 big blinds, I mean, he got lucky that he had a hand. So, you know, his calling range actually might be, you know, much wider than what he showed us right then when he picked up Ace Queen. I think I ran into the top of his range to a degree there. But King 4, you know, is an easy shove, and, you know, I don't think there's any reason to do anything else than shove, with basically any 10 or higher. I'm kind of, when a guy's got 4 big blinds, if you can see here, with 4 big blinds, any 10, 10-5 plus is going to be a profitable shove according to our Nash chart. Okay, and any suited 10, right down to 10-2 suited, is going to be a profitable shove. Okay, so that was a pretty standard shove with King 4. I was unlucky to run into the top of his range, but as I said, I run good and hit my 4 on the end. Okay, so that completes the video series, and it completes part 3. Obviously, our pushing and calling. I'm sorry about my voice and the sniffling and stuff. As I said, I've been sick for a while and kind of still getting over it. So, and I apologise for the delay once again on getting this video out. If you have any questions whatsoever, I've said this before, please don't hesitate to post them in the forum. I'm around the forum all the time. If you have any hand histories or anything like that you want to post in Heads Up NL, I am happy to go over them. Any ideas for anything that you guys wanted to see in the future, just let me know. I hope you guys have enjoyed the series. I'll be talking to you soon. Good luck in all your games. This is Matthew, MJW006 Wakeman, signing out for part 3 of Heads Up Sit and Go's Print Money. Peace.